Well, hello, folks. This is Ryan again with the CactusCon crew, and I am here with Yael and David, who just gave an awesome talk. Thank you both for your talk. We really appreciate it. You're both return speakers, and I personally just absolutely love to see that. So, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to kick things off here with beginning our first giveaway of the day, and then we'll get to a Q&A. So today we're going to be giving away, starting off, Real World Python, the No Starch Press book provided by our wonderful sponsor, No Starch Press. So I'm going to go ahead and kick this sucker off right now. There you go. Head on over to the giveaways channel up at the top in Discord. Oh, already sees a bunch of thumbs up. People like these books. Cool. So, Yael and David, again, thank you for being repeat. I love seeing that. I was like, oh, good, they have another talk. That's cool. So we have a lot of fodder to work with for 2020, just in general. You know, I absolutely loved some of that stuff. My favorite, personally, was the breaking into the cell phone. Oh, we broke into the cell phone. We hacked it. We cracked it. But, okay, calm down. So really cool stuff. Before we get to the general Q&A, are there anything you want to say specifically, or you want to just get to it?
I'm okay.
Yeah,
just
I don't
kidding.
really have any specifics.
All right, let's do it. We have a bunch of good questions. One of them, I want to start off with this one. It actually came from YouTube. Any discussion on Verizon cyber reporting? Most people, believe it's credible.
I mean, I've only seen the DBIR report and have used that to just cite some examples of where people have kind of said, hey, in this history, there's been this many attacks. I think a lot of what they've mentioned doesn't seem to fly in the face of any other reporting around that, so it seems fine, but I haven't dug too deep into it.
So a little random background here. I did a lot of threat intel for a while. The Verizon DBIR, when they request data from people, they request that everything matches what's known as the Veris framework, which has been around since at least 2011 when I first learned about it. I worked at a place where we actually, all of our stuff in our ticketing system mapped directly to Veris, which made it super easy for aligning our expectations and our goals and whatever on that report and reports like it. So we could look at that and go, oh, look, this terminology directly matches what we're doing. The problem that I find is that there are a number of organizations, I'd say most, don't use, excuse me, I don't know about most, that was stupid, sorry. But many who don't map to Veris or even know that it exists. So all of a sudden you have whatever taxonomy they're using in their threat intelligence platform. If they're in MISP and they're using, 13 of the, how many are there now, 100 or whatever taxonomies to categorize, even just like an IP address. Like, what is that? Is that C2? Is that CNC? Is that just delivery? Like, however they're aligning that. And then when they report to Verizon, there has to be a mapping, right? Of, okay, well, what is that actually in Veris language? And I personally think there's some fidelity lost in there. And you may have some mismatches and slightly misreporting because of that. But overall, I mean, I read them every year. I love them. So another question. Can you guys talk about portmap.io in Grok or Tor2Web a bit more? I'm interested in cloud penetration testing or external perimeter testing. Which would you say is the easiest to set up for a POC?
I mean, I've kind of played with Tor2Web for some things, but not anything. It was just more of just like, oh, cool, here's how you can view some Tor things. Yeah, I don't really know the details on what the, I guess, end goal for that would be, so I'm not sure what to advise on that.
Ooh, here's a good one. With tech reporting and standard reporting, the goal is to be fast and accurate. How do you think tech journalists can do the accurate part better? They're usually very fast to release articles.
That is a really good question, because I feel like the places that are the fastest often have the most errors, because there is kind of a trade-off. And so it's really easy to say, like, don't publish until you have it right. But then there's also like the problem of speed. So one thing you can do is if you have fact checkers on your team, and I used to do this when I used to ghostwrite for this very popular health site, and I just like had people checking, like, I'm like, please just read after me as I type it and just double check these studies to make sure they say what I think they say. So that can be one way to do it. And then just the more knowledge you have overall of a beat, the less likely. Like I can just see article headlines and be like, this looks a little sketchy. And then also just building these sources and just having, I know there's like a hackers that are media friendly, they'll just answer questions that you can just have on speed dial and be like, oh, I'm reading this thing. And they'll immediately be able to tell you like, no, this is overblown. You can't, like, this isn't hacking signal or whatever. So it's kind of, I think, a combination of those things.
Do you find in the industry that those fact checkers are often technical in nature, or for that matter, very technical, or for that matter, have the background of InfoSec? Because I would see that, I would think that would be very different, as far as research and knowing how to do it and really understanding like, oh, that's not even possible. Do you see a lot of like technical people in those roles, or is it primarily folks who have just gone through journalism, to the point where they just become that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on where you work. And so like sometimes there are fact checkers that are really technical, but sometimes when I say fact checkers, I don't mean like somebody in the role of a fact checker. I mean, that other tech reporter who knows this really well and is, like, do they have a chance to look over it really quickly? But yeah, I don't know. It's hard to find, like, especially for editors, it's hard to find editors that both know how to edit and are technical because, you don't get paid as much for editing. Most people who are really technical go into tech. And so it's hard to find, I constantly am having to have, not at my current job, but like when I was freelancing, constantly having to correct errors that editors introduced and try to get them to change stuff and fix it. So yeah, it's not easy. Like, I don't think any of this is easy, especially, if you're trying to get stuff out fast, like you are going to sacrifice accuracy sometimes. But then there's also stories that people have worked on for months that have errors. And so it's just prioritizing that and figuring out the best way to kind of do it.
Thank you. Kind of a follow-up to that, really. I guess we're dovetailing into this one. Any thoughts on ways to incentivize accurate reporting? Profit motive is for flashiest headlines these days.
I don't know that that's always true. Like, a lot of people say like, oh, this is clickbait and they're just writing these headlines to get me to click on it. But a lot of the sites that people say that about are they don't, that's not the metric they're going for. They're not going for clicks. They're going for like either subscribers or like time spent on page or some other metric. So I feel like that's kind of an inaccuracy when people are like, fucking clickbait, But yeah, I think I think like maybe reaching out, like I get a lot of emails anytime somebody thinks there's an error, and sometimes they're accurate, but a lot of times they're not. Like a lot of times it's a matter of opinion, or maybe the person commenting hasn't done their research. So I think like a good way to incentivize it is by like spreading work that is good and talking to reporters who do a good job. Like maybe like when you're trying to tell somebody about your story, take it to people who will care about accuracy and just being good about doing that instead of just like whatever the flashiest headline is. Like I think that's a big incentive for me, is just kind of building trust within the community. What do you think, David?
I mean, I think a lot of those incentives are already there. Journalists don't want to get a reputation as being somebody that is willfully inaccurate and full of errors on their reporting. Otherwise, they don't get a job. So, and it's already kind of a hard enough proposition as it is. That being said, like there's a lot of reporting done by a wide variety of news outlets. Like news is not just the game of, the big broadcast companies and the big papers anymore. We have a lot of independent media outlets with a lot of other economic alignments that are a little bit different than just, a giant, corporate kind of collection of papers. I don't want to name any specific ones, but just like anybody in the media knows, it's like, yeah, they just bought out this thing. But there's other stuff out there. There's the Markup. There's like all these other people doing really good work. And I would recommend diversifying your media intake.
I think also like I wish there was less of sort of a stigma attached to making corrections in media. Like I feel like if I mess something up, I want to correct it, and so like sometimes you'll hear people say like, oh, isn't that the writer who had like 3 corrections and got this thing totally wrong? And then you have reporters who just double down when they're wrong and like will never admit it. Like one of the people we roasted last year, it's like you have a bad headline, every person in the industry is saying this is incorrect and they just won't admit it. And I think it's because there's that stigma. So I wish it was a little bit more like tech, where it's like, oh, you just closed all these bugs. That's like a positive thing. Like if there's an error in a story. And then also just realizing it's not always the writer. Sometimes it's the editor and they might not want to admit it because you don't want to throw your editor under the bus. But a lot of stuff you might think like, oh, this writer got this wrong. Like it wasn't actually the writer. So it was like a last minute change they didn't even see or approve. So.
That's a powerful sentiment thought. I did so in tech and consulting, like a lot of us, we write reports all the time, right? We have a QA process. We have where I work at BlackBerry, another sponsor of ours. We have an amazing tech editing and QA team, but the consultants, we still get the last view and the last like, all right, yeah, it's cool. Like we have to click the approve button right before that goes to the client. Thinking about, you can write this article, whether it be an hour long, I spent an hour on it, or months long, and poured your heart and soul into it, and then all of a sudden the editor essentially maybe has the last say. Thinking about not seeing the last version of that before it goes out, like as a consultant, I was like, ew, no, like, no. That's
yeah. And there's also like weird trickery where it's like everybody's working in a Google Draft and then like they'll make changes after it's already in the CMS and be like, can you read this over? And it's like, oh, I have to like cut and paste it all and then combine these to see what was actually changed. And yeah, and it's like sometimes really last minute. And so there's a lot, but I mean, also editors do sometimes fix writer errors at the last minute too. So it's not like editors are always bad. It's just that like the person you think might have written that bad headline or had that error, like it might not actually be them. So just being aware of that before you paint them with a broad brush.
Another advantage to have an editor, actually, if you're coming in from more of a technical background into writing, which is like most of what my writing is, it's really useful to see what changes they make, to see like how what you've written could be misinterpreted. So if an editor is coming in saying like, let's simplify this graph into something a little bit easier. I'm like, that's not what I said, but the fact that you read what I said and this was your take means that maybe we should revisit this in some way.
I think that's one of the things that we consultants often do, blue team or red team, whether it's IR or pen testing, especially pen testing, you have to have legal's take on it. And many times it has to be worded for legal, right? So we have that. And I have to just imagine like that's just one facet of the type of people who are going to be reading your stuff and interpreting your stuff. So
yeah, I've had that happen too. Sorry, I mean to interrupt you, but I've had that happen where legal like changed a headline or changed a phrase and it sounds really vague, and then people will attack it and be like, "Oh, so you're not sure this is the case?" It's like, no, just legal told me that we had to hedge a little just in case to try to avoid this lawsuit.
Yep. Many times I'm like, this happened, and legal's like, let's just say. I'm like, all right, I guess. Another question, right in the same vein of all this great discussion, by the way. I'm loving this. Should journalists that work in tech be vetted for their understanding of the field on which they're reporting? Most journos don't necessarily have backgrounds in specific fields, and with so many getting tech things wrong, should there be some type of bar for entry?
Okay, so I have a couple of answers to that, and the first one people don't really like to hear, but I feel like if you're really, really, really good at tech, you're not like it's hard to write for like a normal audience, like a general audience. And also like even if you really have tech chops, you're writing about broad things. So even like say you're like really, really good in cloud or Android or whatever, and then suddenly you're writing about something completely different, you wouldn't pass the litmus test for that. And I think it's less about like, do you have a tech background to be able to know this off the top of your head, to like, can you understand what people are saying, and make corrections? But absolutely, if you're trying to decide whether or not to talk to media, totally you should vet that. Like look at the journalists, look at things they've written, and, ask around if they've interviewed people, like what was the experience like. And you can also decide, like there's just you can decide to answer stuff over email if you don't want to accidentally say the wrong thing. Some places will let people review their quotes before you publish. So there's like if you're worried about being misinterpreted, I think that it's like on you to vet the writer, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's based on their technical expertise, but more about their like ethics and kind of how they work.
Cool. There are a lot of questions. We're definitely not going to get to them all. Just throwing that out there. It just shows that it was such a great, stimulating talk. You know, people are like, "Well, wait a minute. Whoa, wait a minute." How should orgs best present themselves, in your opinion, rather than simply saying we take security seriously?
I do some writing around VPNs, and the thing that I always look for is the balance of, or I guess the ratio of like jargon of like Switzerland based, NSA proof, not in the Five Eyes, versus like we didn't use the default OpenVPN cipher suite because there's vulnerability in this kind of in CBC or whatever, and then like we did this and this. And our WireGuard implementation, we didn't just say we use WireGuard. We actually looked at the August 2020 issue where like there's default logging on the server side. So if they're willing to go in, if you're willing to go into detail, that's a sign of credibility, in my opinion. Especially if you're going up against a writer that is particularly technical and looks for those things, or just somebody that is advising on something like that, because you want to make sure that you want to be as transparent as possible on what you're doing. I do not want to run into a website's about page or product page and see like, we use RSA encryption. I'm like, literally everything uses RSA encryption. That doesn't really say anything. But going into depth, having white papers, like really kind of like throwing it all out there and letting people know what your product is made of, I think is the best way to present yourself.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'd also add that like being honest about what you can and can't do. Like don't just throw locks up all over your page and say like you can I feel like a lot of the stories I've had that maybe companies didn't like, or it's because they were claiming to do things that they couldn't do, and then they get really weird when you ask questions about it. So just being honest about like no, we can't do. I think like there's some sites that do this really well, like the new the new email service. They're like, no, we're not end-to-end encrypted. Like they're very like honest about what their limitations are. There was Encrypt.me did this too for their VPN. They were like, no, this won't actually help you have additional security if you're already using HTTPS on these sites, and just being like really honest. Like that's something that I look for.
I love that combo. It reminds me of the general bingo card at a conference. Like especially RSA, that's the famous one, right? Your RSA bingo card when folks come in and they're trying to slang their products, and it's all, over the years they've changed obviously, but big data. And then 1 year it was big data, and then it was a data lake, and then it was blockchain, and you're just like, oh God, come on, shut up. I got a computer for my kid, and the motherboard, the BIOS, when you boot it, it says military grade capacitors is on the BIOS, and I was like, what the? I was like, shut up, dude. It's a great computer, and I love him for selling it to me, by the way. I hope you're watching. But it's just funny. I was like, military grade capacitors. That's how you're gonna say, okay, that's gonna make me buy the motherboard. It's the same thing with tech, and you see it all the time. And I really love that you mentioned honesty and security, but honesty in terms of capability. So many of us in the security community are like, oh, I can do this and I can do that and I can do this. Sure, but when people ask them, can you comment on so and so? There are certain people who will still comment on that when they have no business commenting on that. Like myself, zero red team true capability, right? I suck when it comes to pen testing or exploit dev or any of that stuff. And my first thing is like, I'm the wrong guy. Don't even ask me. And we see a lot of folks in our field in security who, in their Twitter accounts or whatever, they're commenting on these things, and they're like, that's not your background. That's not what you do. And so to see that from a journalist point of view, that's, and how they blend is
I think there's actually like the PR angle, because a lot of people are saying like, should we vet journalists? It's like, should you vet the PR people in your own team who maybe are saying things that are wrong or like completely contradictory to what you're saying? And so part of what I have to do, because I talk to a lot of PR people who really don't understand the products, which is like, maybe I don't know exactly if that's their job or not, but to get them to take a question from the media seriously and get the right people on the phone, like get the tech guy to answer this question, because clearly you're just cutting and pasting something from something they gave you a while ago. And there's really good PR people who do understand tech and know how to delegate that. But like, I don't know, there's just a lot of sites that they're like, I'm like, your site says you do XYZ, but you don't actually do that. And they'll be like, oh yeah, our PR people. And I'm like, you know, the company hires the PR people. It's not out of your hands. Like you can tell them, like, don't say this thing about our product that's incorrect. Like you have the power to do that. So.
Yes, I agree. I love it. Again, whole bunch of awesome questions. We're getting close on time here, so I'm just going to pick. Here's the good one. Thoughts on standard response / defense tactics of documents information is stolen as opposed to whistleblowing, getting multiple sources for information.
Oh, like the ethics of reporting on stolen on like hacked documents.
I like that. Let's go with that.
Or that I quite understood the question. I think it really depends on the situation and if it's like in the public interest. So if somebody gets you something that's really juicy, but it's and like would be interesting, I don't think that's always, like, for me, that doesn't always meet my bar for like, is it ethical to report on this? Like, is this in the public interest? And it's kind of a personal decision. And conversation with your editor and the site you write for and etc. But for me, like the bar is kind of high. I don't know if that answered the question though. I don't think I understood the question.
Nor did I, but you know what? I liked your answer anyway. So, so again, there are a bunch of questions in the chat. If you folks happen to have the time and can pop into like the hallway or maybe, you know, and give some love there, that'd be great.
Oh yeah.
Thank you so much for coming back to CactusCon, being a virtual conference and you know, feeling so new and then yet seeing familiar faces and having that old warm feeling. That's where it's at. So
thanks for having us.
Yeah, heck yeah. I hope that maybe we'll have you again and again and again. All right, cool. So thanks again, folks.